Hi, in this one we're going to be going ahead with question 3 of part 2 loops. Question 3 is titled average. In this exercise you will be creating a program that computes the average of a collection of values entered by the user. The user will enter 0 as a sentinel value to indicate that no further values will be provided. Your program should display an appropriate error message if the first value entered by the user is 0. Alright, so this is pretty straightforward. Let's take this step by step. They've also given us a hint which says because the 0 marks is the end of the input, it should not be included in the average. Awesome. So let's get to PyCharm and see what all we can do. So first off, what we need to know is that, well, we need to compute the average. To compute the average, we need to sum all the values and then divide it by the number of values. That's a simple average formula. How are we going to get the values? We're going to be getting the values by asking the user for input for all of these values. And once the user enters 0 as an input, we should stop taking values, calculate the average, and display it. So let's do this first thing simply. So step 1 is to create all required variables. I think the first required variable would be sum, and I would make that equal to 0. The second required variable would be a counter. So what are we going to be using the counter for? We're going to be using the counter to determine how many values the user has entered. Now, let's go on to the next step, which is to write an infinite while loop to take the user input and calculate the sum. Now, why is this really going to be an infinite while loop? Well, this is going to be an infinite while loop simply because we need to take in values from the user continuously until the user enters 0. So, well, we don't know how many times the user will enter a value. So we just need an infinite loop which constantly keeps asking the user for input until and unless the user enters 0. So to do that, we'll simply create a while true loop, which is already an infinite loop. And we'll write if the input is 0. So here we need to take our user input. So let's take user input as a variable equals a float input. And we just write enter a number, and then we can write if user input equals 0, then just break out of the loop. Else, what you want to do, so we're really not going to write an else statement here. So once it breaks, it just breaks, so we don't need an else statement. And if this statement is not executed, or this if structure is not executed, we simply want our sum equals sum plus the user input. Now, why do we want sum equals sum plus the user input? We want this because the sum variable is updated by adding its current value to the user input as many times as the user enters a value other than 0. So we are constantly calculating the sum or summation of all the values that the user enters, which makes our work so much more easy. Finally, out of the while loop, once we have the summation, we want to find the average. So let's create an average variable. Average equals 0, and then we can write average equals sum divided by the counter. But, well, we haven't really initialized our counter yet. We've got our counter defined here. It's counter equals 0, but counter is always going to be 0. So here, every time you sum a value, you also want to increase the counter by 1 so that your program knows that you've added one value or you've counted one value into your user input. So counter equals counter plus 1 right here, which basically means that we've counted the value that has been already entered by the user, and now we know how many values have been entered by the user that is stored inside the variable counter. Awesome. Now let's move ahead and see if this program works out for us. So I'm just going to run this. It's asking me to enter a number, so 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10, and then I'm going to enter a 0, which should break the loop out and calculate the average. Alright, so I've done that, but nothing displays because we haven't printed the average, so I'm simply going to print average, comma, our variable, which is average, run it again, type out the inputs again, and then 0, And now we can see that the average is 5.5. That's awesome. Another condition here for our program would be if we enter 0 right here and press enter, the program should still work and give us an error message. But right now it's really just giving us an error. It says 0 division error, or division by 0 error as we usually call it. So division by 0 error is when a certain value is being divided by 0, which is pretty much illegal. It's an illegal mathematical operation in Python. So let's not work with that and actually do some error handling in this case, wherein if the first user input is 0, then our program breaks and also displays an error message. But at the same time, if the user enters 0 as the first input, it does not count the average or calculate the average and gives an appropriate error message. So let's take this step by step. So the first condition here is if the user input is 0 and the counter is also 0, because, well, your counter is going to be 0 only in the first iteration, right? So if the user input is 0 and the counter is 0, then you want to break. If the user input equals 0, just 0, then again you just want to break, and that should basically do it. But how are we going to stop the average from being calculated when the user input is 0 and the counter is also 0? So here, let's create this thing, a variable called a flag. A flag is just like a switch that you can turn on or off. In this case, we can create a flag called, well, is valid input, and make that equal to true at first. So this variable is valid input works as a flag or a switch in our program, which is currently turned on. So is valid input is turned on, and whenever is valid input is true, so if is valid input, then you calculate the average and print the average. Else, you simply print invalid input. The average cannot be calculated. Yep. So how do we still handle this error? So is valid input is true by default. So it needs to be false somewhere for this else statement to be executed at some point in time. So in this case, when the user input is 0 and the counter is 0, which is if the user input is 0 on the first iteration, or the first input is 0, then you make is valid input equal to false. And well, you break, so nothing really happens, and then it comes out and it checks this, and then it goes on to the else statement. So let's see if this works out for us. So again, we'll write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then we put 0, and now it gives us average is 5.5, which is perfect. If I run this again and the first value is 0, it says invalid input, the average cannot be calculated. So guys, that was pretty much it for this one. This is the code. You can always find all the completed projects, all the completed code in the course resources, so make sure you access those if you're having any issues. And you can also always ask us questions down in the comment section below, where my team or I will get back to you ASAP with the best answer possible. Until then, just keep playing around with Python, try to find new questions and new problems to solve online, and well, I'll see you in the next one.